Hello everyone! Last time out, Mr. Mouse made a big mistake. He blew all his cold, hard cash on cheese, and he ended up regretting it. Now, that's the end of the story. He can just start scoffing it down, right? Well, not so fast. It turns out there's a bit more economics to be done, and specifically, he can think about exchanging things.
Mr. Mouse will need to exchange his cheese if he wants to get any variety in his diet. But how do we represent this exchange? And who exactly is he exchanging with? These are questions we want to be able to answer today. Mr. Mouse is loaded up with cheese. Specifically, he has 20 cheese slices. At this stage, we can see that he's endowed with 20 cheese slices. Now, he could eat all that cheese, but he's told us that he sort of regrets just buying cheese and would like some variety in his diet. So he's interested in exchange. Let's look at Mr. Mouse's situation as we stand. The bundle of apples and cheese held by him can be represented in a diagram by this big blue dot. Now let's ask what his indifference curve looks like. As we noted before, the price of cheese and apples was the same when we made his purchase, but it looks very much like he didn't make a choice that is consistent with that, so we can see why he wishes to exchange. To exchange, Mr. Mouse requires a willing partner. This is where our friend Miss Kitty returns. Originally, Miss Kitty was going to sell Mr. Mouse things, but he ran off to New World and purchased all this cheese. However, she is interested in a potential barter transaction, which would allow the two of them to exchange cheese and apples. Now, we may say to ourselves, Miss Kitty is a seller, so we can't use a model of choice to think about her. That is for buyers. But this isn't quite right. In earlier videos, where we treated the price as given for Mr. Mouse's choice, we were assuming that there were willing sellers on the other side given their choices, and for some reasons Mr. Mouse's demand for that product had no effect on their choice about what price to charge. We will discuss this more in the future. However, for now, it doesn't matter that we have previously seen Miss Kitty as a seller. She is someone who wants to exchange goods and services directly with Mr. Mouse. Mr. Mouse himself is selling some goods and services in order to buy others. This gives us a description of where Mr. Mouse's scarce budget genuinely comes from, and it also gives us a way of discussing both selling and buying in terms of choice. So for Miss Kitty, we are going to look at the same type of choice model. She is endowed with a bundle that has a lot of apples and very little cheese, as shown by the big purple dot here. In the same way, Miss Kitty also has an indifference curve of the following shape, and as a result, we can tell that she would prefer having a variety of goods. This could be because she intends to eat them, or it could be that she's a retailer or reseller that likes keeping a variety of products on hand. The motive itself is not relevant, just the fact that she has a similar preference for variety as our friend Mr. Mouse. Now let's give numbers to these bundles. Mr. Mouse has 20 cheese slices and 2 pre-existing apples. Miss Kitty has 20 apples and 2 cheese slices. As a result, there are 22 cheese slices in total and 22 apples. If Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty pulled all of their apples and cheese and then split them evenly, they would have 11 each. How would this look on our diagram? Placing these big black dots on here, we can see that we have a point that is above the indifference curve for both Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty. In other words, if they exchange apples and cheese such that they both have a more even amount of both, we can tell that they would both be better off. In other words, there are gains from trade in terms of both participants receiving a higher level of utility. So, is there some way we can tie together these people's choices in order to think about this exchange? Why don't you take us through that, Matty?
Sure thing, Golnara. So here we're going to draw some boxes. These boxes will help us think about Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty. So Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty are endowed with an amount of apples and cheese, which in turn provides them a given level of utility. For both of these individuals, we can represent all the bundles that give them the same level of utility as this endowment with an indifference curve. This is what Golnara has just taken us through. Now let's take a step back and think about the space we want to analyze this in. I really liked how Golnara pointed out that we could pull together all of the cheese and all of the apples. We're in a world where there is no production of cheese and apples, there is just an existing amount that Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty hold, and we are looking at exchange given initial property rights and the initial allocation of the cheese and apples. In other words, we're considering an allocation problem on the basis of an existing endowment of apples and cheese. So what potential is there for voluntary exchange? This is the box I promised. Both these vertical axes refer to total amounts of apples. However, the vertical axis on the left starts at 0 and increases to 22, while the one on the right starts at 22 and decreases to 0. Similarly, both horizontal axes refer to a total amount of cheese slices, but while the bottom axis increases from 0 to 22, the top one reduces from 22 to 0. So at this stage, I just want us to be aware that we've got apples on both vertical axes, cheese on both horizontal axes, but the axes are behaving in weird ways. So we have this box, but why do we have such weird numbers? To see this, we have to figure out what we've done. What we're doing is we're drawing Mr. Mouse's decision space and Miss Kitty's decision space together, but we've flipped Miss Kitty's choice upside down. Because we have it in terms of everything, 0 to 22, all of the amounts of resources are captured here, but we are putting the allocation of both together. So given this, we can turn around and insert the endowments of our two fine people and then look at their indifference curves. So there are the endowments. As you can see, there are two different dots, but they're on top of each other. So what's happening here? We have Mr. Mouse with very few apples and lots of cheese. You have Miss Kitty, if we read her thing upside down, with lots of apples and very little cheese. As a result, you end up with that point being the initial allocation for both of them. Now their indifference curves function in the same way we had before, but remember Miss Kitty's space is upside down, so we get an upside down version of this U-shaped curve. Now we call this space here an Edgeworth box, and we've used it to represent the initial situation given the endowment of Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty. In an autarky economy, we would stop there, as each individual just keeps their bundle, but we want to look at exchange. So what can this diagram tell us about exchange? First, note that every single point in this box is a potential allocation of goods and services. This is the total amount of resources in the economy, and the point we choose will determine how those are split between different people. There are 22 of each item, and when we select a point, that refers to a given amount for Mr. Mouse about both, and then the total minus Mr. Mouse's amount for Miss Kitty. And every single point in that box represents that. Now to think about how we value things, let's look at the points where the indifference curves cross. Points to the left of the left-hand crossing between the curves and points to the right of the right-hand crossing between the curves are areas that our friends are not interested in. Let's pop a dot in that represents that right there. So how do we understand why they might not be interested in this point? Well, if we look at that allocation, we can see that from Mr. Mouse's perspective, it is below his indifference curve, and therefore he likes it less than he likes all the points on that indifference curve, and so he likes it less than his initial endowment. Similarly, it looks like it's above Miss Kitty's indifference curve, but remember that is upside down. Therefore, if we looked at it the right way up, it is also below her indifference curve, and she would prefer to be at her initial endowment. So both of them are made worse off if we end up trading to a point out there. So what sort of points do we want to look at? Well, we want to look at areas where there are gains from trade for both Miss Kitty and Mr. Mouse, and then that is an area where they might exchange. So if we jump in here, we can see that there are a whole series of points that act in that way between these two curves. Any allocation of cheese and apples in the space produces gains from trade for Miss Kitty and Mr. Mouse. As they are both made better off by that exchange, we would call any exchange that leads to an allocation in that point a Pareto improvement, but we're going to leave that topic for another time. What I want us to think about is that they can both end up better off at higher levels of utility if they do change. So let's imagine a situation where we can actually operationalize this. That's a very difficult word. Well, Miss Kitty has all of the power in this relationship, and she is going to determine how the exchange happens. All that needs to happen is that Mr. Mouse agrees that it does happen. She makes all the choices, he just says yay or nay. Now, for people that have done a little bit of game theory, this is an ultimatum game, and we can think about it as a situation where Miss Kitty has all the bargaining power. In that instance, she picks an allocation that makes her as well off as possible while not making Mr. Mouse worse off, because if it made him worse off, he'll say, go to hell. In this way, she'll select a bundle that is on Mr. Mouse's initial indifference curve, so leaves him indifferent, and she will specifically pick a point that just touches that indifference curve once. This is the bundle that will make her happiest. So we can draw that in here. Now, why is it that point and not other points? Well, if she selected a bundle that was inside the space that's between the two indifference curves, this would not satisfy this. Mr. Mouse is now better off, and those are gains from trade that Miss Kitty could have taken for herself. Furthermore, if she picks a point that does touch the indifference curve, but the indifference curve goes through twice, it doesn't just touch it once, then that indifference curve will also have a point that's within that space where there are gains from trade for Mr. Mouse. As a result, she could have picked that allocation, and then she could have selected one where she gets those gains of trade from herself. So Miss Kitty there could also move to a higher level of utility, a higher indifference curve, by changing what she did. So in this way, Mr. Mouse's indifference curve is actually acting as the budget constraint for Miss Kitty. And just like when we talked about budget constraints and indifference curves, she will be setting that tangency, that point that only touches once. Now, looking at this from Mr. Mouse's perspective, when this specific trade occurs, he sacrifices a given amount of cheese. And that is measured right here. This amount of cheese that is sacrificed in turn allows him to purchase an amount of apples. This is the minimum amount of apples he needs to receive in order to be willing to sell that cheese. That fits the way we described the game before. This can also be thought of as the price of cheese and the price of apples. Here, apples are at their most expensive and cheese is at its cheapest of potential prices that could satisfy trade between these people. Now, flipping this around, we can look at this from Miss Kitty's perspective. Her initial indifference curve tells us the minimum number of apples she would be willing to accept keeping hold of to be just as well as before when turning around and receiving this cheese. So she goes and purchases the cheese, and that initial indifference curve tells us the amount of apples left over she would be willing to keep, such that she's just as happy as with her initial budget. Now, she ends up with more apples than that. That means she gets what's called an apple surplus. She's swimming in extra apples that are more than are necessary to make her want to undergo a trade. That surplus measures the gains from trade that do occur from Miss Kitty and Mr. Mouse trading. But because it's all her getting the increase in utility from that apple surplus, it is all her that gets the gains from trade. Now, there's no reason to believe that Miss Kitty has the greater bargaining power in reality. In fact, it looks like Miss Kitty and Mr. Mouse both have really quite poor diets, and they could do with mixing up their food quite a bit. As a result, how can we think about that trade when it isn't a situation where one person has all the bargaining power? As noted earlier, the gains from trade and exchange are used up when the two indifference curves touch each other once. We could find all the points within the gains from trade region, the bit between the two indifference curves, where indifference curves on the indifference mappings of Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty do touch each other once. So if we go and look at higher indifference curves, bits that refer to higher level of utilities, at that point there will be an indifference curve that represents a higher level of utility for the other person, and they will touch at a tangency, and that will give an efficient trade. If we go and find all of these points, then we get what's called the contract curve, and that's what we've drawn in here. Each point on this contract curve refers to a different price. Specifically, as we move up to the right, less cheese is being sacrificed for a greater number of apples, implying that the price of cheese is rising. Where we end up on this curve depends on the relative bargaining power of our two friends. So, knowing this, we'll let Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty have their little negotiation. Off they go. Now, while they're doing that, I do have to admit that something's troubling me here. Mr. Mouse simply used a dollar coin to get cheese, and Mr. Mouse and Miss Kitty together have just swapped around goods and services that they were already holding, they were already endowed with. But where do these goods and services and the incomes necessary to buy them actually come from? Now, Gulnara and I will have a chat with Miss Kitty, as she's a business owner, and then we'll get back to you. Have a good time, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.